it's my very great pleasure to introduce the Honourable Troy Grant, who is going to talk about the governance perspective of the river system, the Inspector General of Water Compliance. Please welcome Troy Grant.
Good morning, everybody. To all members, colleagues, distinguished guests, a very warm, although chilly in the area, welcome to Tamworth, my childhood home. It's lovely to be back. I grew up in this area from the age of 5 to 18. Love the area, and it's also terrific to be with you all as part of the 80th celebration of the MDA's gathering and this important 80th National Conference. Could I also start, like other speakers, in acknowledging the Gomeroi people of the traditional lands of this region, paying my respects to elders past and present. I also acknowledge all the traditional owners throughout the wonderful Murray-Darling Basin, the area that I have the great privilege to work in every day. I was away last year's conference, unfortunately, but I was ably represented by my deputy, Daniel Blacker, when you all met at Murray Bridge. But it's really nice to be back here amongst a lot of familiar faces, lots of friendly faces, and I look forward to meeting some of those that I haven't met before. And if we're moving around, please grab hold of us and say good day, please, and introduce yourself. And in particular, I'd just like to acknowledge Mayor Russell Webb. Thank you for your hospitality, Russell. It's great to be back here on the Peel River, beautiful part of the Murray-Darling. I grew up, my playground was the Coburn out near Katingal for a lot of years, so I have deep love of river and connection to community certainly started in this region. The topic of the conference that we're all here today, the future of water security, isn't something that I can speak to directly or have direct responsibilities for in my role as the Inspector General of Water Compliance. The reality of my role and that I play in national water security is insignificant. What is not insignificant is the role that we play as a regulator of those who directly or indirectly have the legislated obligations in the water security space. So in many ways, as the Inspector General of Water Compliance, I'm the watcher of the watchers in this area. And while those operators and regulators have an accountability role for water security, my role is to hold them to account for their day-to-day legislated governance, behaviours and practices. This accountability doesn't just rest with the operators of our waterways, it also rests with the regulatory and policy bodies across the state and the Commonwealth governments. So while you'll hear much about water security throughout yesterday and today, I'd like to spend some time talking to you about accountability and, more importantly, how accountability in our world of water, and the world of water regulation in Australia, also protects trust, confidence and integrity. Many of you have been at or potentially heard about the speech I delivered at the River Reflections Conference in Mildura back in 2022. And more recently, you may have heard the follow-up speech that I gave at last month's River Reflections Conference in Albury. I won't revisit the contents of those speech and the ground covered, but I simply want to highlight that's a clear example of accountability and what I've stated publicly on the record before regarding accountability. If through our work I see wrongdoing, I will call it out. If I find evidence that laws have been broken, I'll use my audit, investigation and enforcement powers against any offenders. If I see integrity, performance or implementation failures, I can use my inquiry powers to improve performance and, more importantly, implementation. Accountability, to me, is a fundamental aspect of human behaviour. And I'd like to look briefly at the psychology of accountability to put what I'm going to talk about into a little bit more context. When people avoid being accountable, a conscious decision is made not to do something. And then another decision is made to downplay, dismiss, or reject the importance of not following through. Doing this repeatedly develops a habit, or a culture, if you like, of convincing ourselves that not doing what we say we will do has no real consequences. And that is a very, very bad habit to have. It's a habit that can be fatal for integrity and trust. Non-compliance must equal consequence. No consequences breeds disincentive, and disincentive destroys trust. So within the context of the Water Act, there is consequences for non-compliance. It's called enforcement, and we are the enforcement agency. So during Senate estimates in February of 23, as an example, there was a question raised about how much Commonwealth money has been put aside for implementing the Basin Plan, including how much of that $13 billion has been spent and what is left. A good question, I thought. The answer given to the Senate was a brief answer that didn't come with a lot of detail. I thought to myself, if I was a member of the public, was the response adequate? Was it transparent? As a member of the public, could I take a lot of comfort that there was an adequate trust and transparency in what was essentially a $13 billion question? So as a result, my team and I undertook a transparency review to determine whether indeed a member of the public could see where the $13 billion has been spent or committed over essentially a 10-year period. It's fair to say and expect, with the responsibility of spending $13 billion, you would expect comes a level of accountability. So like I did in the May 2023 Senate estimates hearings, and I must stress that this review was only done on publicly available information, such as budget statements, annual reports and the like. I did not seek to use, nor did I use any of my oversight or inquiry powers, both of which are afforded to me as the Independent Inspector General. The intention of this review was not aimed at uncovering instances of maladministration or deliberate wrongdoing, but simply to establish whether or not an everyday person of the community could see where their money, 13 billion of it, had gone. The Australian public, in my view, had the right to know the answer to that question. For me, the answer was very, very underwhelming, equally as underwhelming as the answer given by the Secretary to Senate estimates. And hence it raised more questions than there were answers for. So the result of this exercise in accountability was me including it in my public submission to the Productivity Commission's inquiry into Basin Plan implementation, which has been well and truly published and is available for you to read. That submission very much focused on a number of areas, including accountability and the transparency of allocation and spending of Australian taxpayer money on the Basin Plan reform funding. I'd also like to add that the central agency responsible for administering the $13 billion, the Federal Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, known as DECU, and I acknowledge there's a New South Wales DECU now, and I'm referring to the Commonwealth DECU, also started publishing program-level financial information as a result of our work for the very first time for you to see. And until then, program details had been far and few between. When people hear figures like $13 billion, tossed around in the media, it can be hard to comprehend. It can become funny money, as the expression is used. The everyday person can find it hard to get their head around that many zeros, or what that actually translates to in a tangible way. What tangible things that affect everyday life for mums and dads, the elderly, or those who are most vulnerable in your communities and across your local government areas. And in the water space, we often hear, and you'd be very familiar with the reporting about water volumes being compared to things like equivalent to 56 Olympic-sized swimming pools, or the media's favourite go-to, the size of 4 Sydney harbours. Even that can be a bit hard to relate to, particularly in the regions, for many people. But to audiences like yourselves, who are well informed and invested in water management and the outcomes, and the many people you serve in your local councils and regional communities, tangible everyday things like a new school, a new hospital, more police, a cancer treatment centre, improved infrastructure like your water treatment plants, sporting centres, cultural centres, and things in your communities that people can easily relate to. Now, as a former local member, minister and deputy premier in state government, I get it. And I know all too well how important things like I've just mentioned are to local communities. And by way of a local example, let me take Tamworth and the $211 million upgrade to the Tamworth Hospital that occurred in 2016 and what it delivered to the community in additional medical, surgical, inpatient beds, day surgery units, paediatric unit, maternity birthing suites, special care nurseries, emergency resuscitation bays, renal dialysis units, oral health unit, operating suites, recovery spaces, cardiac labs, medical imaging, pharmacies, nuclear medicine, ambulatory care. I could go on, even a helipad. That means a lot to communities. So for $211 million, that's real life impacting tangibles that can be easily touched, seen, and more importantly, understood. Swapping over to the water context, when we're looking at an enormous figure, not too similar to the $211 million within our $13 billion Murray-Darling Basin Plan, $180 million has been allocated and spent in the Northern Basin Toolkit. And it may look like a small program, $180 million out of $13 billion. So I've just given an example of what impact $211 million can have on a community. It's life-changing, it's life-saving. What's the impact and the spend of the toolkit been? How has that impacted the community? So, accountability for the expenditure of public money rests with those agencies and entities charged and trusted with its management, allocation, distribution, and remittance. So for Commonwealth agencies and entities, they're under the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act of 2013, known colloquially as the PGPA, which has 5 general duties that public servants of all levels, from junior staff through to the secretary, must exercise. 1, a duty of care and diligence. 2, a duty to act in good faith and for proper purpose. 3, a duty in relation to use of position. 4, a duty in relation to use of information. And 5, a duty to disclose interest. So as a statutory office holder with oversight, monitoring, regulatory functions and powers, I commit to you to deliver trust and transparency around the management of Murray-Darling Basin water resources. Ensure that the highest standards of accountability for all involved in the use and management of basin resources, including state and Commonwealth agencies. And my ongoing engagement with the community and honest conversations with you on the management of basin resources. So as I work through the exercise of using that public available materials to follow where the $13 billion had been distributed and spent, I've started to form a bit of a view. It may not surprise you. And that is accountability in regards to Basin Plan implementation and the work being done is not good enough. Not even close. Not even within a bull's roar of being good enough. And therefore, is worth looking into. Through our engagement and community sentiment research work, the communities are out there telling me and my team that trust and confidence across the Basin Plan has been waning. The community has had concerns about aspects of the Basin Plan, its implementation through programs, projects and priorities, and I have the responsibility under the Act to deliver back that trust and transparency around the management of the MDBA water resources. Equally, I have a legislative responsibility to ensure the highest standard of accountability for all involved in the use of management of basin resources occurs. And I take that responsibility very seriously. As a naturally curious person with a long policing history behind me, my antenna immediately signalled it was very much going into overdrive. There was much I could now do, much needed to be done, things I am empowered and authorised to do. But, as you will all know well in the local government space, that takes money and resources. And at the time, much like water, both money and resources allocated to me were finite. And that was until the most recent budget in May of 2024, where the Minister and Government listened to what I was telling them regarding what I was hearing from you. And the end result was they've given me an additional investment of $7.15 million each year over the next 4 years to my budget to ensure we can do what we are legislated to do and expected to do and what is needed to be done. That's $28.6 million extra to give us the properly funded resources we need to exercise the powers afforded to my independent role of oversight, inquiry, audit, compliance and enforcement. So our immediate future and our operating environment will be very different than the last 2.5 years since we were established. So for example, if a project, program or infrastructure somewhere in the basin with millions of taxpayers' dollars allocated to it has not been delivered or is years overdue, it's going to get a closer look. My interest in having a closer look may very well be motivated by the community continuously telling me something isn't right and it's worth having a look at. My point, if an agency or an entity has the Basin Plan accountability and is being tasked of delivering that outcome, but over consecutive years has failed to deliver, and that community continues to raise red flags, I'm feeling very motivated to act. And how may I act? It's reasonable now to expect that I am funded with $7.15 million to act. I may very well start using my inquiry powers. Similarly, if an agency or an entity has not met the standards of accountability, not exercised good governance, failed to meet legislative requirements in the use and management of basin resources, I may use my audit and/or investigation powers to look further into those matters. So since the office supporting me was stood up in August of 21, there has been some concern across the basin that because my office sits within a Commonwealth agency, we may not be so inclined to look at issues or concerns close to home. By way of background, I commissioned an independent audit into the department, Commonwealth DQ, in response to a matter that was formally raised with my office. That audit is currently in the very final stages of being prepared for release, and there'll be more on that in coming weeks. But the community can take comfort, I assure them. As an independent statutory officer, if there's an issue raised of concern, I will call it out. I want to address this a little further, especially in the current context of the Australian government last year, who commissioned an independent review of my office and myself. Those findings and recommendations have been received and responded to by the government in June of 24. The independent review by Mr Peter Harris AO made 11 recommendations and 8 observations. The Australian Government has agreed in principle to 8 of the 11 recommendations, with a number of these recommendations implemented as part of the 24-25 budget. A key recommendation of the review, in summary, was to allow me to establish my own in-house legal counsel to advise myself, separate from any legal advice or counsel that was previously given from the department. This is critical, particularly where there was a clear conflict in providing legal advice that may affect the department. And this goes to something I'm going on the public record for, saying early in my tenure as the Inspector General, we cannot have people or agencies marking their own homework. For the record, we are in the early stages of establishing and recruiting that independent in-house legal counsel, just a matter of weeks away. Also in the review, Mr Harris' recommendation 3.3 in summary calls for the IGWC to be a separate, non-corporate Commonwealth entity with the employees that assist me, currently seconded from the department to the IG, public servants from the department, to no longer be employees of that department, but in a nutshell, standalone, fully independent agency. In response, the government noted that recommendation by saying, quote, matters of governance and organisational structure will require further analysis and will be considered in consultation with relevant stakeholders of part of the statutory review of the Water Act in 2025. This recommendation to me is crystal clear, needs little to no further analysis, and I believe is hard to defend and is indefensible to not adopt, especially since it exists with 2 other Inspector General structures who we have been recommended to replicate. As I said, there were 11 recommendations and 8 observations in the independent review of the IGWC. It can be easily found online, and I encourage you all to have a read. Basin states and communities can absolutely take a high level of trust and confidence that I, as an independent statutory officer, will maintain that independence and fight hard for it during any current or future arrangements where a Commonwealth agency supports my function. Keep in mind, bills need to be paid, HR matters dealt with, service procured, staff provided to assist me with my work, and all administrative support critical to the operations of my office. But there should be no doubt in people's minds that if a Commonwealth agency appears on my radar for not meeting the accountability thresholds I've mentioned earlier, there will be zero fear or favour from me exercising my oversight, inquiry, audit, compliance or enforcement powers to address and to remedy any issues. People who make the rules and administer the rules and hold others to a high level of accountability cannot break the rules or choose the rules they wish to follow and not expect to be publicly held to account or in fact be held to a higher standard as the rule setters. In 2023, the IGWC was added to the official list of Australian national integrity agencies. This is something that I and the office that supports me are very proud and grateful to be part of, complementing the key functions that we hold as the IGWC, which are oversighting of those Commonwealth agencies under the Act, oversighting the basin states under the Act, enforcing compliance under the Act, conducting our inquiries into how agencies perform their obligations under the Act, and engaging with the Australian public on the management of the Murray-Darling Basin water resources. We're doing that work in your local government areas. I have staff living and working in your local government areas. They are active members of your communities. As part of the increase to our budget, I will be recruiting new staff to continue critical IGWC work across the basin. When I call for an inquiry, that inquiry will be held in the most appropriate location, closest to that of concern. that might very well be in your local government area. This might mean setting up a work area where I can interview witnesses and gather evidence. It might mean bringing my IG staff to support me with investigations, public information sessions, community engagement, evidence gathering on the ground and in the field. These staff will need temporary accommodation. They will need food and places to eat. Witnesses may need to travel to stay in your town, supported by my office to do so. Our on-ground work will contribute to the economy of your local communities where we need to do our work. It is my intention that where and whenever possible, we will undertake our inquiry work remotely from a faraway city, and this is very much supports the foundational ethos I established and I've had from the beginning. If we are to support the basin, then we must live and work in the basin. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said at the beginning of this, the role of the Inspector General of Water Compliance in water security is very small with little to no real impact. Where we do have an impact, and I hope you understand from my talk today, is the role we have in affecting change and supporting the success of the Basin Plan by delivering trust and transparency around the management of the Murray-Darling Basin water resources. Ensuring the highest standard of accountability for all involved in the use and management of basin resources, including state and Commonwealth agencies, and our engagement with the community on basin management resources. I wish all members and delegates the very best for a successful and meaningful, insightful 80th National Conference here in Tamworth, along the banks of the mighty Peel River, integral part of the Murray-Darling Basin system. Thank you for your time today.